Okay, hi. I'm Gil Rosen, president of the Stanford Blockchain Accelerator. Quick 2-second background on me is ran a couple of companies in the data and analytics space before switching to investing. Was at GSB and now doing a degree in policy and running the Accelerator. For those of you interested, the Accelerator incubates teams from the Stanford ecosystem, either current students or alumni, for 5 months, and we help them every step of the way until they launch. As part of the series, we host a number of interesting folks with experience and insight into the Web3 space to share thoughts. And today we've got Seth Rosenberg from Greylock. Seth will give us a bit of background on how he got into crypto in general, but he's invested in a number of both crypto and non-crypto platforms, including Chia, Espresso, Ribbon, Roblox, and before that, he led product for the development platform of Facebook Messenger. So Seth, thank you for joining. Excited to dive into the topic of opportunities for DeFi and bringing DeFi mainstream with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gil. And nice to meet everyone on the call. I mean, I'm sure I can learn a huge amount from each one of you. So I hope we can make this into a two-way dialogue at some point. And Gil, just for context, what's the kind of background of most of the people here? Is it mostly early stage founders, people curious about potentially starting a company?
So this is a mix. It's students from our Web3 entrepreneurship class, as well as people from the Stanford blockchain community as a whole. So it's a mix of founders, people that are interested in general, people that are working, etc. But our hope here is to something that excites me and that I'm really interested in digging into is what does it take to actually bring Web3 mainstream? What are the gaps that are missing? So I also think that will help inspire folks to hopefully start companies, and we're still taking applications. Technically, they were due yesterday, but if you want to apply for the Accelerator, we'll have a look at your application if you can get it in the next few days.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to dive into this, and hopefully it's interesting for people.
Definitely. Well, why don't we just initially start with just a little bit about you, your background. How did you get into crypto Web3? We'd love to kind of hear like how, what your journey was to becoming an investor in the space.
Yeah, so I've been at Greylock for about 6 years, focused mostly on early stage crypto and fintech. As you said, my background before was in product. And for me, it's just been a journey of, seeing data points and just growing conviction as a user and consumer and investor until finally you go down the rabbit hole far enough where you finally, in my opinion, it feels like you see a secret that the rest of the world hasn't yet seen, and you just can't unsee it. And that's just been really exciting for me. And so for me, like a couple moments are things like, one of my best friends, Jill Carlson, we worked together at Goldman back in the day. She was a trader, for a Forex trader, and she kind of authentically, felt that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies could solve a lot of the challenges that she was seeing on the trading desk, and then joined crypto back in 2014, right? Then at Greylock, we invested in Coinbase in 2017. I started to learn more about the space, started using things like stable coins for payments with my friends, understood things like, scarce digital assets with our investment in Roblox, right? Where people would literally spend $10,000 to buy a hat for their avatar, right? And obviously that was within the closed loop system of Roblox. That wasn't, an NFT on the blockchain that was more interoperable, but it just like all of these little data points over the last several years, seeing some of these value props within crypto. And I would say over the last couple of years is when I've really started to focus on it as one of the primary things that I invest in at Greylock. And for me, just like use cases like payments and lending, I just think the infrastructure is going to unlock an amazing amount of opportunity and access. And yeah, excited to dive into some of those topics.
Awesome. So, I mean, we live in the US, where we have, in some ways, relatively decentralized systems and platforms. I think there's an interesting value proposition in emerging market where you have weaker institutions, where you might have inflation, et cetera. But, if we take a look at traditional finance, where are there challenges right now that present opportunities? Where do you feel that kind of the current financial system in the Western world is missing, or what gaps are there?
Yeah, the amazing insight to me is just all assets and money are just entries in a database. And the existing system consists of databases that don't talk to each other very easily. And that creates a lot of friction for people, right? So for example, if I want to send money internationally, my bank, their bank needs to confirm that I have the correct amount of assets in my bank. And what that means practically is 3 to 5 day settlements, $40 wire fees. You just can't move money around very easily because it's going from one database to another with messaging systems that don't talk to each other very easily. Because you have systems like Swift that are basically messaging systems between banks, and not all banks are part of that system. And then that system, is slow and costs money. So even just that use case, right? You have $700 billion a year in remittance payments. And these are usually for lower income people, right? People who have come from other countries, work in the US, and are sending money back to their family. And the average fee of that $700 billion of international remittance payments right now is 6.5%, right? So even if you just had a system that made it easy for you to transfer value globally, right? For example, using stable coins, I think that opens up a lot of freedom, not just for the existing, market, which is obviously much lower than it would be if it was easier and cheaper, right? I think if you actually enable microtransactions globally, you can start to enable a lot of marketplaces and services and economic opportunity for people outside the US that doesn't exist right now.
Awesome. Completely agree. I mean, I guess we have some services like this, right? So there's Circle, there's Revolut. What are they missing? Why are these not enough or sufficient? We have Lightning. Why hasn't this been adopted at a mass scale? I guess Revolut has been growing quite a bit, but even them, it's kind of its own ecosystem.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's companies like TransferWise that have solved, international payments in certain corridors, right? They get a bunch of banking licenses and they build liquidity pools in both sides so they don't need to constantly do FX, right? And so there are solutions to many of these things in kind of the Web2 world. The Web3 world, I mean, I do think this is already starting to get adoption, right? Last month in October, during this crypto winter, there was $500 billion of stablecoin transaction volume. Now, I don't know the exact breakdown between how much of that is just, inter-account transfers and trading versus legitimate cross-border payments and remittances, but these use cases are growing. I think, one of the barriers, obviously, when Bitcoin was the only thing in crypto, there were a ton of issues with using that for payments, right? There's things like throughput, transaction fees, volatility of the currency, privacy, right? So there's a lot of issues of using Bitcoin as a payment network. Many of those have already been solved, right? So you've got stablecoins built on top of Ethereum, which solves volatility. You've got layer 2 scaling of solutions, which helps with transaction fees. You've got more scalable L1s like Solana that help with transaction throughput. And then you have companies that are like Espresso that are helping with transaction privacy. I think a few of the remaining things that need to be built still are great off-ramps in different countries. But I actually think we're really close to crypto being kind of reliable rails for international payments.
Awesome. Yeah, just one other thing you mentioned earlier before is that kind of in the Web2 space, we have Swift and we have all these ACH and we have other payment platforms, so to speak. I think the interesting note there is that those are bank-to-bank payment transfers, and actually you're not owning your own money. Banks own your money. You're not initiating a transfer. You're asking a bank to initiate a transfer and then relying them to use some sort of interbank technology to send the money to someone else's bank, where they're relying on them to actually hold that money for them. And again, we're using these centralized systems versus you actually owning your money in your wallet and you initiating a transaction on payment rails that allow you to then kind of send that to someone else.
Yeah, definitely.
And one of the things that I think we were going to chat about later today is, okay, well, only so many of us have wallets. That experience itself has its own challenges. How do we move to a place where more of us have wallets, and how do we incentivize people to actually adopt these wallets if for most of our day-to-day lives and our transactions for the last 50, 100 years, these systems have actually worked.
Right.
So kind of digging a little bit more on like traditional finance, where do you feel like there are other gaps that DeFi could potentially solve? So you spoke a little bit about payments, but where else?
Yeah, the other use case I'm really excited about is lending, right? I think what we've seen is basically crypto is operating in this like sandbox where like early crypto adopters are kind of playing around with the cutting edge of what kind of blockchain technology can enable, but that's not really accessible for the mainstream, right? Because for a variety of reasons. And so I think part of what I do as an investor is like, okay, I observe like what are some of the use cases that have come out of the sandbox that are like fundamentally amazing and better than what exists in the traditional system, and then what needs to be built in order to take those use cases mainstream. So I think one of those use cases is lending. Yeah.
Would love to hear a little more about that, because I mean, there are plenty of lending protocols, both in centralized systems. There are some in the decentralized. Like your average person is not currently using crypto to get a loan. And what's the use case in lending that you see DeFi as being particularly applicable to? Right. I mean, even when people are borrowing money at this point, usually they're borrowing money on margin to buy more fake internet money to speculate. So like,
Right.
is that actually adding real value? Like where do you feel like DeFi can add value in a real world sense, and how do we?
Yeah, that's the fun thing. I'm sure everyone on this call, like being deep in crypto, it's you can separate kind of like what exists today versus what the technology can enable, right? And with lending, I think like two fundamental features of DeFi lending that I think are really exciting is one is anyone can verify assets using software in real time. And then two is you can assign any type of control over those assets using software. And if you compare that to the existing system, like lending is either explicitly like lent against collateral or implicitly, right? So you're either like specifically collateralizing a loan and having certain covenants with that collateral, or you're just underwriting the financial statements of a person. And what's amazing to me is like the majority of loans that exist today in the traditional finance world are underwritten by people downloading PDFs of their brokerage statement and emailing it to their lender. And then multiple weeks will go by for a human underwriting team to review those PDF statements, call your bank to verify the assets, and then eventually issue a loan. Right? I went through this process a year ago. I took out a margin loan against some of my stocks. And this is with like a tech forward bank. This is the process. Obviously, it could take like 45 seconds for me to edit that PDF document, add a couple zeros to it, and then send it, right? You don't do that because it's illegal, but it's not hard to do. Whereas in crypto, like in these DeFi lending protocols, anyone can verify that this wallet address, owns this amount of assets, and using your private key, you can verify that you own that wallet address, right? So using software, you can immediately and in real time verify assets and then assign control over those assets. And I think this fundamental shift, like, just can make lending a lot more efficient, reduce fraud significantly, reduce human operational costs, which, not only just brings down the costs of lending and increase the profit for lender, but also makes it way more accessible, way more programmable.
Okay, so it's this idea of having more accessibility and programmability, because we've got platforms like Cabbage or or I think the on deck, where you can kind of give them an API into your bank account, can algorithmically give you a loan relatively quickly for up to a certain amount for like a small business loan. So this concept of algorithmic lending to some degree exists. You can have Plaid, which will automatically give you access to some of your data to be able to provide it to others. But it seems like from what you're describing, many of the assets which you would want to be lending against are not either digitized or not interoperable in a certain way. So can we then in some fashion digitize our either digital assets or physical assets, whether it's equities or homes or cars, and then that allows for more programmability and liquidity and openness?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think fintech and crypto are kind of both marching towards the same end goal, which is interoperability, automation, intelligence around personal finance, right? Bringing fees down significantly, bringing, automation up significantly, right? And so the way that this is being built in traditional fintech is basically, how do you create APIs that basically patchwork these databases together so that, people can build on top of it, right? So for example, like if you want to underwrite my loan, if you want to lend me money based on my bank account statements, now because Plaid was built, which enables access to all of these banking databases, I could log in with Plaid, and it's relatively easy for you to underwrite based on my bank data, right? That's not necessarily true of equities today, right? So there's a few issues. One is, the Plaid for X doesn't exist for a lot of things. So for example, like it's not ubiquitous for brokerages, as an example. Two is it's typically a read-only API, right? So you can read the data from my bank account, but you can't necessarily sign a smart contract to get into an agreement with the cash flow from my bank, right? And that's a key difference, right? So right now, not only is it hard to read, what stocks I own in my brokerage account, but also there's no write functionality where like I can say like, hey, through a smart contract, you can collateralize my 100 shares of Apple. And then three is it's not real time, right? I think it's about 1 day delayed with Plaid. And so
Right.
I agree, like they're both marching towards the same end goal. And I'm optimistic on both traditional fintech and crypto. I just think crypto is has this beautiful architecture where it's an open database. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think to kind of speak towards that, it's the difference between walled gardens where these centralized entities still actually own the assets themselves and allowing you to have APIs to try to operate with them, but ultimately you don't have control, versus digital assets where you actually do have your own ownership and you can then allow for programmatic kind of smart contracts to access, to update, to change ownership. And that allows for, of course, a lot more applications to be built in types of lending a lot faster, right? You're not dependent on a third party agreeing to whether or not you can use your stocks or your car or whatnot as collateral. So to that point, if really what it takes is this digitization of assets onto a blockchain so that you have this ownership, I mean, there's a lot of assets, right? The world is pretty big. Where do you see as like interesting opportunities to start here, and what potential what potential challenges might there be, or what potential opportunities are there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And basically, DeFi lending works extremely well if you have crypto assets. If you do not have crypto assets, it's not useful to you, right? So like if you have crypto assets, you can press a couple buttons and within 30 seconds, you get a loan in your wallet, and it's extremely low operational costs and it's amazing. So the question is basically three things. One is like, how do you bring more real world assets on chain? Two is how do you tie identity and credit to a wallet address so that you can lend based on your reputation in DeFi on chain, which you can't do right now. And then three is obviously we need some regulatory clarity around how to actually build these systems. And so the first question is like, how do you bring more off-chain assets on chain so that it's accessible, this system is more accessible to more people? I think a lot of people in the crypto world like have been really excited about like, how do you tokenize your home? How do you tokenize your car? How do you tokenize jewelry? I'm actually less excited about that category because I just think it's operationally very difficult to have like a real world price feed of like, what is the home even worth? It's also a physical asset, right? So like, what if I renovate it? Like, how does that impact like its tokenized value, right? I just think there's a lot of practical complications with, and also regulatory complications in terms of, you know, when you're tokenizing private equity, for example, do you need to be an accredited investor, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm actually more excited about as a starting point is tokenizing public equities.
Interesting. What are the regulatory challenges around that? Like, is that something that someone could build a startup to do, or is that something that, you know, it's a Coinbase, or I would have said FTX, but not anymore, or like a Goldman or a Robinhood that's going to do that?
So I'm definitely not a lawyer, and so I don't want to, you know, I think basically it requires a lot of research around the right way to do this from a regulatory perspective. But from a technical perspective, I think it's much easier. And there's certain types of regulation that are easier with public equities. So for example, you don't need to be an accredited investor to own a stock, right? So you eliminate that complication. And you eliminate a lot of technical issues, right? Which is just like, what is the value of the home? And how is that, right? Because right now, like the custodian of the title of the home is like some local government agency. And so like building an API on top of that and then tokenizing that seems just really difficult. Whereas with public equities, you have $12.5 trillion of value in the US, and it's already, you know, digitally custodied. And so building an API into an existing digital custodian where you already have like an agreed upon second by second price for this asset, representing that on chain seems more technically doable. But I think there's still unknown questions around regulation.
Okay, so we're talking about like it makes sense. It's easier for you to take relatively digital native type assets, such as equity, and to kind of create some sort of blockchain tokenization of those assets that you can use for things. What are the types of use cases that you would use this for? Is this like, I want to, you know, buy a cup of coffee and I haven't been paid yet? Well, coffee maybe not, but a fancy dinner. And I want like a flash loan, or is this more, I want to, you know, leverage equities in one of my brokerage's account for some sort of you know, to purchase things in another account, or to in a more interesting way to buy a car, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, I think like one thing to unlock DeFi, right, is just have more assets on chain. And so I do think like someone needs to build this. So I view it as, you know, building kind of like a circle for equities, right, where someone custodies, you either do B2B2C, like you enable like Schwab to do this, or you build your own custodian, you custody the assets, and then you tokenize them. And the use cases, I think, are pretty broad. Like to start, 24/7 trading, right? So it's not just during market hours. Second is global access, right? Anyone with an internet connection and a wallet could theoretically trade. Instant settlement, right? So right now, when you trade equities, it takes 3 days to settle. So when you do all this activity on chain, it's instant settlement. Eventually, you would have the ability to off ramp, right? But all of the activity on chain, you know. And then, as you said, margin lending should be much more accessible, right? Because in today's world, the only entity that can effectively lend against your shares is your brokerage or your bank, wherever it happens to be custodied. No one else can easily give you a loan against your assets because, again, they can't verify those assets in real time and they can't assign control over those assets in real time because it's in a database they don't control, right? And so you have this huge marketplace for margin lending, which, like you said, you know, could be used to bring down the APRs on your credit card, or it could be used, you know, for a lower cost personal loan. I think it gets even more interesting because what you're really doing is you're entering into, you know, programmable finance. And so one just kind of maybe extreme example, but it's kind of interesting is, let's say you work in tech and you have a concentrated position, right? Let's say you were an early employee at Facebook and you have a big Facebook position, right? In order to diversify your risk, you can do at least three things. One is take out a margin loan, right? So whatever, that would be easier on chain, even though it's possible off chain. The second product you could do is what's called a cashless caller, right? So you basically write call options against your shares and earn money from that. And then you buy put options. And what that does is, for no money up front, it basically limits your upside, but also your downside. So you're basically limiting your risk of your exposure without incurring capital gains. And then the third option is what's called an index swap. So you can basically like pledge your shares to an index product, and a bunch of other people pledge their shares. And in return, you get basically a share of this diversified index. So without having to sell your shares on day zero and pay 40% capital gains, you can basically pledge your shares to this index fund, right? And so the point is that there's a lot of financial innovation that's available to the very wealthy, but it's very costly to execute, and therefore it's not available to most people. And so all of these types of innovations, I think, could just be dApps that are just available at the push of a button if you had this ecosystem of people that had tokenized equities.
One last question on this, and then want to move on to like other digital assets or other types of lending that are not potentially like collateralized. Why do you think this doesn't exist already? Right? Is this a regulatory gap? Is this a technological gap? Is this just someone has it done? Is it market power? I mean, crypto's been around since 2013. We've been hearing about tokenization of assets for a while. Why hasn't anyone done this yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are still regulatory questions that need to be solved, to make this really possible in a way that's really unlocks all of the benefits of it for consumers, right? So I think that regulatory clarity is a big question. I do think people think that there's only an incremental benefit in doing this, right? Because public equities are kind of, everything I'm saying sounds a little bit esoteric, right? But I do just fundamentally believe that making finance more programmable and more accessible is going to lead to a system that is just much more interesting and better for consumers. Right. And so like stablecoins is my best example here of like, oh, the benefit's only incremental, right? Because you could say like US dollars work pretty well, especially for Americans. But it turns out that like 3-day settlement, the problem with international transfers being high fees and slow, like digitizing dollars was not an obvious idea. And it's now one of the killer apps in crypto, right? $500 billion a month in volume in stablecoins. So I think the similar thing with tokenizing equities is there's a lot of people who would say like the benefit is actually just kind of incremental. I don't think that's true. So I think those are the two big issues is regulatory clarity and just there's a bit of a chicken and the egg in terms of utility, right? Because until a lot of these applications that I'm describing are built, there's not a huge amount of value for it. And then it's kind of hard to get distribution.
I think you can use Plaid as the example. Again, I don't think people really clearly understood how much a fintech, especially consumer fintech, Plaid would enable by having all these additional applications that are now easily able to be developed until it was actually developed. And in a similar way, by opening up these ecosystems, there's a ton of value that can be had. One use case is even just saving, right? If you're wealthy, you have any number of ways that you can save. But let's say you're not that wealthy and you want to save with an ETF, and you put money into an ETF. If you have to pay off credit card debt, you sell that ETF. Where this potentially gives you the option of leveraging that as a collateral against paying off a debt to some degree, and you're still able to leverage the appreciation. Are there any other like digital assets? I think some of our conversations, you meant like AR and AP, something similar like what Pipe is doing in some way. Would love to hear about kind of, your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think like accounts receivable, accounts payable factoring is an interesting entry point, partly because there's fewer regulatory burdens there, right? A lot of regulation exists to protect consumers. And so when you're talking about business lending against accounts receivable and accounts payable, there's just lower friction from a regulatory perspective. I haven't done a deep dive, honestly, in like how to actually bring those on chain and how to, because the problem is there's no shared ledger right now to actually bring on chain. So you have to solve that problem first and then bring it on chain, which is why I like public equities, because it's kind of simple, where it's like there's a digital asset and you just build an API, right? Or an Oracle. Whereas like ARAP, there's more technical work that needs to be done. But I do think it's a really interesting area to explore. I just haven't done a deep dive yet.
Okay. Yeah, it's there's also the question of how do you actually control the flow of capital? Would you change your receivable to go to a wallet, and then if you haven't paid back the loan, then the wallet gets paid? Okay, well, there's collateralized lending. We spoke about how physical objects, it's still kind of hard to tokenize them, though there's obviously tremendous value there. Digital assets is probably easier, but there are regulatory hurdles there. What about like non-collateralized lending and more credit-based lending? What do you think is necessary and missing to move to a world where we can have perhaps credit in a DeFi space or more uncollateralized lending or under collateralized lending?
Yeah, I mean, it's simple. It's just connecting real world assets, income, and identity to a wallet address, and then having an opt-in identity permanence, right? Because part of the issue right now is you can just blow up a wallet and create a new wallet, and if you default on a loan, and there's no recourse, right? Whereas like the credit system that exists in the traditional world, you have a permanent identity, which is like your social security number. And if you default on a loan, that stays with you. And I think, you can't just blow up and create a new bank account and say, oh, what? That was someone else, right? Now, I do think the magic of crypto is that you give more control to people, right? And so I think people should be able to opt into that, right? I think you should be able to have to get an anonymous loan and not tie it to a permanent identity. I just think it'll be more expensive because it's higher risk for the lender. But I think we need to build tooling so that you can opt in to take a loan that's attached to your permanent identity on chain that can, for example, report back to the credit bureaus as one example. And the reason that you would choose to do that is just because you get a cheaper loan. Yeah.
So do you view this as like credit bureaus will continue to exist, they're necessary, and we just interact with credit bureaus on chain? Or is this something where you can create some sort of ecosystem that potentially avoids credit bureaus, or they're, to truly understand like on like IRL, I guess, credit, you need to involve the existing institutions in play?
It's a good question. I think in the near term, you want to leverage the existing infrastructure in order to make it work. I'm hopeful that long term, maybe they won't be necessary. I think there's one category of like, how do you properly underwrite someone? In that case, credit bureau should not be necessary, right? Ideally, you can just, have Oracle's APIs that like upload data on chain using zero knowledge proofs so that, a lender could verify that this wallet address has over 750 FICO score, earns X amount of dollars, has X amount of assets and liabilities, and all of that data can be verified without the lender actually seeing the underlying data and without the lender actually tying that back to my identity. Because, using zero knowledge proofs, that's possible for them to verify that the data is true without actually seeing the underlying data. And so, So I don't think the credit bureaus are necessary for underwriting the ability to pay, but I do think they're useful in terms of the recourse, right? Like if I do not pay, what's the consequences of that? And part of it, if it's a collateralized loan, is you can have a smart contract that automatically executes a margin call. But if it's an under collateralized loan, then what's the recourse of me not paying? And there are companies that are working on-chain credit scores. I think they still haven't figured out this problem of identity permanence. If someone could figure that out, I think without the credit bureaus, I think that's a big opportunity. I don't know what the answer is though.
So is this like soulbound NFTs, and for us to truly have on-chain credit, we need to actually have soulbound NFTs that people buy into?
Yeah, you mean like an NFT that represents your like biometric identity?
Yeah.
Basically? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's one. Yeah, and again, what I love about crypto is like you can choose to use that wallet that has your soulbound NFT or not, right? And you'll just get a different price for your loan. But what I'm also excited about is like right now, I have to like, in a very unsecure way, send PDF documents and email my social security number to a bank, right? And they analyze it using their like one credit team. Like what I imagine is a system where like you have millions or tens of millions of people, submitting zero knowledge proofs of like, here's my data. And then you have millions of bots and algorithms that are just analyzing this data and competing for the most efficient underwriting, right? Because it's all just available via software. So it's not just like 5 dudes in a room looking at your PDF statements. It's like anyone can participate and compete based on whatever data is available to give you the best price loan. And then capital providers can plug into those underwriting algorithms, choose whichever one they want to use, and basically deploy based on the risk tolerance and return tolerance. And that's what's exciting to me, is you create this incentive system rather than the bank saying like, you must tell me your income and you must do this. It's just an incentive system. Like I can give you no information and pay a higher price, or I can give you as much information as possible, ideally like in a zero knowledge proof, protocol, so that I don't actually have to be exposed to my data leaking. There's a clear incentive for me to do that because I just get a cheaper loan.
So I love that specifically, right? This concept of you can actually share more information in a way that is private and secure, and create this greater liquidity of algorithms and potential risk models that can analyze you for potential risk and give you a certain type of loan with a certain type of rate that currently you're limited by the X number of banks that you can actually go to. And again, a lot of this kind of comes down to getting this off-chain information on-chain, and how do we, in an easy way, get information such as your income and your bank statement history, your income history, your asset history. It's all of these things on chain, and then what that actually empowers is in many ways limitless by creating this liquidity of information and access to credit. Curious, like, who's doing interesting things in this space? What are you seeing? Are there companies that you think are starting to nip at the buds here? What excites you in terms of the things the ideas that you're seeing, the people that are building?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's all super early, so I think there's still opportunities for entrepreneurs. But there's a company called Spectral Finance that's doing on-chain credit scores, right, by looking at activity and wallet data. There's a company called Merlin that's doing really interesting kind of like block explorer analytics to give to dApps to like understand more about the wallet that you're interacting with, the customer. There's things like Polygon ID that's experimenting with some of these zero knowledge proof concepts that I discussed. There's Clance, right, which is working on-chain identity. Espresso is doing a lot around zero knowledge proofs and privacy. So yeah, I would say a lot of really great projects, but I think it's still early in terms of traction, and I think there's still more to be done.
Okay, and if we think about types of challenges that we have, there's Oracle-like, there's tokenization challenges, which is how do you actually get off-chain digital or physical assets on chain. There's information challenges of how do you leverage oracles in some way or form to get, information activity, off-chain activity on chain, so that can be leveraged from broader risk perspectives, value perspectives, etc. There's infrastructure challenges and there's regulatory challenges. We can't necessarily change regulatory challenges easily, but perhaps people can team up with folks from the law school to figure those out. We spoke a little bit about the off-chain data on-chain. Curious from where are there opportunities, or where, what are things that need to be fixed on the infrastructure side, or potentially like on the Oracle side before we are able to gain like mass adoption? Because assuming we do have, liquidity of data and interoperability of assets and access to credit and capital, these things need to be able to perform. They need to run. They need to be reliable. So what are the gaps from an infrastructure perspective that you think need to be tackled here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, right? And that's what's so fun about this. That's what's so fun about this space. It feels like tapping into kind of the network effects and liquidity of Ethereum is still valuable. I think L2's scaling solutions for Ethereum haven't solved a lot of fundamental issues around, like, for example, data availability. I think privacy is still like a massive and super interesting challenge, right? Because all the benefits that we've been talking about, where like anyone can verify assets, anyone can move assets, because there's this public ledger that trades off against privacy. So yeah, I mean, I still think there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also just a lot of amazing projects at that level. So I'm actually excited for entrepreneurs to like tackle more of like the application level stuff that we're talking about here, right? Which is because I think the infrastructure is sufficient for it to be useful, even though there's more to be done there, right? Like on the application level, like if you take lending as one use case, like for example, there's no order book to match borrowers and lenders directly, right? Right now, all of the DeFi protocols are just pooled vaults with fixed terms, right? So Aave, Compound, MakerDAO will just say like, hey, you can post Ethereum as collateral, you can post Bitcoin as collateral. If you post Ethereum as collateral, it's 160% collateralization ratio, and here is the spread, right? That's how it works today. If you have an order book that matches borrowers and lenders directly, then you start to have an incentive to bring a lot of these things we're talking about, which is like, hey, I'm bringing my real world identity, income, assets on chain, and therefore I'm going to get a better rate. But right now, you don't even have the decentralized exchange to match people.
Gotcha. Okay, so two separate things. So like order books, AMMs for lending is one interesting space that hasn't been kind of solved yet. That if it does solve, then there's a lot that opens up in terms of allowing more people to lend and more people to borrow overall. Separately, there's kind of the infrastructure side of things where you were saying that you think that there's a lot that's left on the application level, but even on the infrastructure level, things like performance ZK computing, would also open up quite a lot. Most likely, I'm assuming reducing cost and improving performance and reliability are key here as well, especially for things that are privacy preserving. Cool. And again, I'm just trying to think of projects and applications that or challenges that super technical folk like are probably on this call can look into and try to solve here.
Yeah, I'm sure they can educate me on that as well. But I mean, there's a ton of opportunities around decentralizing sequencers for L2s, solving data availability, solving privacy, solving high transaction throughput while still maintaining decentralization. but I'm not going to tell Stanford PhDs in cryptography or whatever how to do that. I think hopefully the perspective that's valuable here is just around the market opportunities and applications of this technology.
Yeah, and to the point made earlier, like it's this chicken and egg, right? It's the infrastructure that's built needs to have a use case for it to actually have real value, especially in this climate where getting investment dollars is harder, and you want real revenue because people aren't speculating as much. So you want to have those real world applications that help drive infrastructure and essentially drive capital towards infrastructure, but at the same time, you need to make sure that the infrastructure is good enough for you to have these real world applications. We've got some time left. Would love to open it up to folks who might be interested in asking questions as well. Feel free to raise your hand. All right, we've got a hand raise. Yeah, Ramesh.
Sorry, quick question. This is not directly in DeFi. Is it okay if I ask a question on DeFi?
Of course.
Interested in hearing your comments about usage of blockchain in healthcare applications. Have you seen them come across your table, and if so, in which areas?
That's a good question. I haven't. Yeah, I'd be curious if you've explored it. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting applications around the same core concept, which is like what data is siloed in which databases, and how do you make that available to more people and programmable in terms of research and user control over privacy. But it's not something I've spent a lot of time on.
Yeah, I have looked into this. The biggest challenge is healthcare in general doesn't like innovation and is very resistant to systemic change. And blockchain is an ecosystem problem. If you think about it, as everything is a multi-sided marketplace, you need to seed one marketplace at one side of the marketplace. If you have a two-sided marketplace, it's hard enough. You have a 5 or 6-sided marketplace, as you do in healthcare. It gets really difficult to make any changes, especially with entrenched interests wanting to kind of keep things as they are. Georgie.
Yeah, thank you, Thes. Appreciate your thoughts. My question is around privacy. Where do you see the biggest use cases for privacy right now, and maybe evolving in the future if we look at 5 years from now?
You mean in DeFi specifically, or in general?
Like we touched DeFi specifically, but there are other applications, right? Like it might be salaries, it might be DAOs. So everything needs privacy, but in terms of the market opportunities there.
Yeah. I mean, the most basic that I'm excited about is just international B2B payments, right? There's $10 trillion a year in international B2B payments. And again, I really believe stable coins and blockchain infrastructure is just more efficient for international payments, right? It's instant settlement. It's like 1 or 2 cents even today versus $40 for a wire fee and 3-day settlements. And so, but as a business, I don't want to leak to the world, how much I'm paying my employees, who my suppliers are, how much I'm paying them. For example, even with Greylock, like if I want to make an investment using stable coins, I don't want TechCrunch or whatever to pick up 2 seconds later that our wallet address just made an investment. We want to be able to control, and the company wants to be able to control when they want to announce. So like, I'm not like this privacy absolutist, right? Obviously and so I'm not extreme on this. I just think like your entire net worth and all of your payment history being publicly available, it is not practical, right? And so, yeah, payments I think is one, but really any financial use case, like, again, you should take a look at Kate protocol built by Espresso, which is a Stanford team, and they're doing kind of basically programmable privacy where you can wrap Ethereum assets but they also enable a view key for the asset issuer, because that's kind of another fundamental problem that needs to be solved. Is you can't have, either extreme transparency or extreme privacy, because the extreme version of privacy doesn't enable things like KYC and AML and compliance.
Thank you.
Awesome. We've actually got a couple teams in the Accelerator that are looking at B2B payments.
Cool.
A lot of the challenges end up being usability, onboarding, like that user experience. It's the developer experience, the user experience. It's every aspect. It's amazing that crypto's come as far as it has, and blockchain's come as far as it has, given the it's slow, expensive, unreliable, horrible to develop in, and horrible to use, which I guess speaks to its power. Any other thoughts or questions?
Oh, I had a quick question on my end. You talked a lot about like payments and remittances and things like that. So I was just kind of curious, like in the status quo, is the technology the limiting factor, for these troubles that you're talking about in terms of like speed and everything? Like remittances, from my understanding, is slow because of like fraud detection and things like that. But I wasn't sure like what your, do you feel like it's a trade-off between speed and fraud detection or things like that when we're thinking about remittances or payments and things like that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think fraud detection is partly a function of the system that it's built on, right? And so if it's easy to send money from an account that doesn't actually have the money, and then it's a 3-day settlement period, and other people can withdraw, and therefore there's insufficient funds. Like if the payment system itself is vulnerable to errors like that versus kind of instant settlement, then the fraud risk increases. I do think like the payment rails, I agree, it's not the entire problem. But I do think like the existing payment rails are limiting, because it's old school messaging systems built between banks that don't talk to each other very easily. And because of those settlement times, and risk for basically things to change in between when the payment was initiated and when it's settled, it creates costs, and those costs need to be borne by the users. And that's why you get like these $20 to $40 fees, and so having like a single ledger that's global to, and I send you a stable coin, like my balance goes down instantly, your balance goes up instantly. There's a lot fewer vectors of fraud and costs. There's still challenges with that, like how do you off ramp that money, right, in the local currency, because you can't use stable coins to buy your groceries in the Philippines. And so the question is, and that's also where a lot of the cost comes in right now with remittances, and that's still an unsolved problem here. But I think the technology still does help.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and on that, a lot of the KYC, AML, fraud detection type stuff is more on the amounts versus the time. Like they're not spending 3 days going and researching if someone is fraudulent or not, and just this idea of transactions, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 is also like these are artificial boundaries that have been established by banks for any number of reasons, whether it's historical, whether they're taking your money and doing things with it, etc.
Yeah, anyone on this call, feel free to reach out. I'm just Seth at Greylock.com. Obviously would love to, be part of this community and hopefully, help on your journey as you guys are thinking about ideas and building companies.
Awesome. Thanks, Seth. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for all joining. And hope you have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Gil.